What makes a space queer? Queer architecture, Borderlands, and the politics of space. The relationship between architecture and power has long occupied scholars working across geography, urban theory, feminist criticism, and political philosophy. Within queer theory, however, architecture has often occupied a more unstable position. Queerness has frequently been associated with movement, ephemerality, performativity, and the refusal of fixed categories, while architecture has traditionally been associated with permanence, order, and institutional structure. Lucas Baylory's article, Expanding Queer Architectural Theory Towards a Framework of Decolonial Queer Borderlands Architectures, enters this tension directly by asking how queer theory might expand prevailing understandings of architecture and space beyond the limited frameworks that have historically structured the field. Baylory argues that queer architectural theory has made significant contributions to understanding how gender and sexuality shape spatial organization. Yet, the field remains geographically and epistemologically constrained. The article contends that much existing scholarship has centered wealthy, urban, Western, and predominantly white queer experiences, while marginalizing other forms of queer spatial life, particularly those associated with borderlands, racialized communities, precarious economies, migration, and ephemeral forms of inhabitation. The article therefore proposes a broader framework that would place decolonial borderlands thinking, queer of color critique, trans theory, and spatial ephemerality at the center of architectural analysis rather than at its margins. One of the central concepts organizing the article of homonormativity, drawing on Lisa Duggan's influential formulation, Baylory describes homonormativity as a political and cultural formation in which certain LGBTQ identities become incorporated into neoliberal systems of citizenship, consumption, and domesticity without substantially challenging dominant social structures. Duggan describes homonormativity as a politics that does not contest dominant heteronormative assumptions and institutions, but upholds and sustains them while promising the possibility of a demobilized gay constituency anchored in domesticity and consumption. The article emphasizes that homonormativity is not simply about sexuality, but about the alignment of particular queer identities with systems of racial, economic, and national privilege. Bellery's contribution lies partly in extending this creek into architecture and urbanism. The article argues that many studies of queer space have focused on highly visible forms of urban queer consumption, such as gay neighborhoods, bars, clubs, luxury homes, and commercial districts. These studies have been important for documenting LGBTQ histories and forms of spatial organization, but they have also produced a narrow understanding of what queer architecture looks like and where it occurs. The article repeatedly returns to the problem of geographic narrowness. Queer architectural scholarship has largely concentrated on major metropolitan centers in the global north, particularly coastal cities in the United States and Europe. Within these frameworks, queer visibility often becomes associated with urban density, nightlife economies, commercial development, and forms of architectural permanence tied to wealth and property ownership. Baylory points out that this emphasis reproduces broader inequalities within queer representation itself, because the queer spaces most likely to survive historically are those attached to economic privilege and institutional recognition. The article therefore asks, what kinds of queer spatial practices disappear when architectural analysis remains focused on fixed, monumental, or commercially visible spaces? Rural queer life, borderland communities, temporary gathering sites, informal care networks, shelters, precarious housing arrangements, and ephemeral social spaces often remain underexamined despite their importance to the lived experiences of many queer and trans people. Bellery's intervention is not simply additive. The argument is not merely that scholars should include more examples. Rather, the article suggests that expanding the geographic and political scope of queer architectural theory fundamentally changes what counts as architecture in the first place. To demonstrate this shift, Baylory synthesizes several recurring themes within queer architectural scholarship. The first involves the destabilization of public and private space. Drawing on feminist and queer critiques of architecture, the article argues that queer spatial practices have historically blurred distinctions between domestic intimacy and public visibility. Traditional architectural thought often assumes a stable separation between public and private domains, with domestic interiors associated with intimacy and exterior urban space associated with public life. Queer spaces, however, have frequently unsettled these distinctions. Baylory discusses how queer bars, clubs, and social spaces often enabled forms of intimacy that moved between concealment and exposure simultaneously. Architectural arrangements such as dark lighting, labyrinth interiors, mirrors, hidden alcoves, and layered spatial arrangements facilitated forms of social interaction that complicated normative distinctions between visibility and privacy. The article cites George Chauncey's observation that for many queer people in early historical periods, privacy could only be had in public, particularly in urban environments where same-sex intimacy depended upon coded forms of visibility within public space itself. The article also examines how queer architecture frequently relied upon forms of visual signaling and coded aesthetic communication. Baylory references scholars who describe queer architecture as operating through passing, camp aesthetics, and forms of architectural cross-dressing in which buildings simultaneously conceal and reveal queer identity. Queer architecture therefore emerges not simply as a matter of who occupies a building, but as a set of spatial practices involving visibility, ambiguity, theatricality, and coded recognition. This concern with visibility leads into another major theme of the article, spectacle. Baylory notes that queer spaces have often depended upon highly performative forms of architecture and design. Nightclubs, bars, dance floors, and other queer gathering spaces organized bodies visually through mirrors, runways, balconies, lighting, and decorative arrangements that facilitated both display and observation. These environments produced what some theorists describe as organizations of gazes, spatial systems that shaped how people looked at one another and how desire circulated socially. The article emphasizes, however, that visibility within queer space has always remained politically unstable. Increased visibility can produce recognition and collective identity, but it can also invite policing, surveillance, and regulation. Baylory discusses the transformation of gay bars in cities such as San Francisco during the 1970s, where architectural openness and transparency increasingly became associated with middle class respectability and forms of behavioral normalization. Architectural visibility does not automatically produce liberation. Visibility itself becomes entangled with class politics, racial exclusion, and forms of social discipline. Another significant aspect of the article concerns desire and spatial organization. Baylory draws heavily from scholarship examining how architecture facilitates forms of social and sexual interaction. Queer architectural theorists have frequently argued that design influences patterns of encountering, cruising, observation, and intimacy. Architectural features such as mirrors, layered sightlines, balconies, corridors, and open floors shaped how bodies moved through space and how relationships formed within these environments. The article's discussion of cruising is particularly important because it expands architectural analysis beyond formal buildings. Queer theorists have queer theorists have examined public parks, restrooms, piers, abandoned industrial spaces, cemeteries, and neglected urban landscapes as forms of queer spatial production. These analyses challenge traditional assumptions about architecture as permanent or institutionally designed space. Instead, architecture becomes relational and situational, emerging through patterns of use, movement, desire, and collective behavior. Baylory extends this argument into digital space by discussing scholarship on apps such as Grindr. These digital platforms reorganize urban interaction by altering proximity, visibility, and patterns of social encounter. Some scholars cited in the article even argue that digital platforms themselves function architecturally because they restructure how individuals inhabit cities and interact spatially. The article therefore treats architecture not only as material construction, but as a broader organization of bodies, movement, communication, and social relations. The article's most significant intervention emerges in its discussion of ephemerality in Borderlands. Baylory argues that many queer spaces exist only temporarily, and in its discussion of ephemerality in Borderlands, Baylory argues that many queer spaces exist only temporarily, and therefore resist traditional forms of architectural documentation. Temporary dance nights, improvised gatherings, shelters, informal support networks, activist occupations, and short-lived community spaces frequently disappear within leaving stable archival traces. They typically disappear without leaving stable archival traces because architectural history is often privileged permanence and material endurance. These forms of queer spatial life remain marginalized within architectural discourse. Baylory suggests that ephemerality should not be understood as absence or failure. Instead, ephemerality reflects the material conditions under which many marginalized communities survive. Queer and trans communities frequently create space under conditions of precarity, displacement, economic instability, and social vulnerability. The temporary nature of these spaces therefore reflects broader political conditions rather than architectural insignificance. This framework becomes especially important in the article's engagement with Borderlands theory. Drawing from Gloria Anzaldúa's concept of the borderlands, Baylory argues that borderland spaces are not limited to geopolitical borders, but include broader conditions of marginality, hybridity, and colonial violence. Borderlands architecture emerges from overlapping systems of racialization, migration, labor precarity, colonial history, and spatial exclusion. The article introduces the concept of decolonial queer borderlands architecture to describe spatial practices that emerge under these conditions. Importantly, excuse me, this framework shifts architectural attention away from monumental buildings and towards improvised adaptive and relational forms of spatial organization. Baylory argues that queer borderlands architecture often operates through survival practices rather than formal design traditions. One of the article's most compelling discussions concerns Rasquachismo. Rasquachismo, I can't say that right. A Chicano aesthetic tradition associated with working class creativity, improvisation, and survival under conditions of scarcity. Baylory cites Tomás Ibarra Frausto's description of Rasquachismo as an underdog perspective in an environment always on the edge of coming apart. End quote. Rasquacha aesthetics value adaptation, reuse, improvisation, and forms of cultural production created with limited resources. The article argues that Rasquachismo offers queer architectural theory, an important alternative to dominant architectural aesthetics associated with wealth, minimalism, and institutional prestige. Borderland queer spaces frequently emerge through improvisation rather than polished design. These environments may appear unstable or fragmented according to dominant architectural standards. Yet they produce forms of belonging, care, and cultural continuity that remain politically significant. Baylory also emphasizes that architecture cannot be separated from broader systems of embodiment and political power. Drawing on theorists such as Paul Preciado, the article describes architecture as a biopolitical technique that organizes bodies through spatial regulation. Building structure movement, access, behavior, visibility, and institutional participation. Hospitals, schools, housing systems, border infrastructures, and urban planning all participate in shaping normative assumptions about gender, sexuality, citizenship, and bodily legitimacy. Within this framework, queer and trans architectural practices becomes forms of spatial disobedience. They disrupt dominant assumptions about who space is designed for and how bodies are expected to move through institutions. Baylory's discussion of trans architectural theory is particularly important because it introduces movement, transition, and relational becoming into architectural analysis itself. Rather than treating architecture as fixed or static, trans architectural theory emphasizes processes of transformation and instability. Toward the conclusion of the article, Baylory argues that queer architectural theory must continue expanding beyond its traditional epistemic boundaries. The article briefly identifies several additional areas requiring further engagement, including Black diasporic queer theory, disability and crip theory, Asian queer aesthetics, and Spanish language borderlands and scholarship. The essay therefore positions itself not as a final framework, but as part of an ongoing effort to decenter dominant forms of architectural knowledge production. What ultimately emerges from the article is a substantially expanded understanding of architecture itself. Architecture no longer refers only to professionally designed buildings or formally recognized urban spaces. Instead, architecture becomes inseparable from questions of migration, race, colonialism, precarity, survival, and embodied social life. Temporary gatherings, care networks, shelters, improvised domestic arrangements, digital interactions, and borderland spatial practices all become architecturally significant because they shape how people inhabit the world collectively. Baylory's article therefore contributes not only to queer theory, but also to broader debates about knowledge, history, and spatial politics. The essay challenges architectural discourse to consider which spaces become visible historically and which forms of inhabitation remain excluded from institutional recognition. In so doing, it suggests that architecture cannot be understood apart from the uneven distributions of power that shape visibility, permanence, and social legitimacy themselves.